really delighted that we have with us today Professor Dame Jo Da Silva, who has earned global recognition as an engineer who has applied her knowledge and her design expertise to improve safety, promote inclusivity, and enhance the resilience of communities, of cities, and of infrastructure globally. Jo is currently Global Director of Sustainable Development at Arup. She has an honorary doctorate in humanitarian engineering from Coventry University, a gold medal awarded by the Institution of Structural Engineers in 2017, and only last year was recognized as a Royal Designer for Industry for Sustainable Design. She's also an Arup Fellow promoting excellence and innovations to secure societal benefits. Jo, we're very excited to hear from you. Over to you.
Thank you, Pam. It's a real pleasure to be here. I should just first of all make clear that I'm actually not a professor. I am a dame. I do have an honorary doctorate, but I'm not a professor. But I will do my best to profess to all of you now. This is a really important subject. As Pam explained, my career started as an engineer, designing buildings, originally in London, then in Hong Kong and Europe and East Asia. But I then moved for various reasons into post-disaster relief work and development. And climate change has been one of the really key issues that has dominated the work that I've done. And I'm a passionate believer in the importance of the Sustainable Development Goals, providing us a guiding star as to where we need to get to in 2030. And I think it's these four goals together that have really sort of shaped a lot of the work that I've done and a lot of the work that the International Development Team at Arup have done. And that's the challenge of addressing poverty and gender equality, which are really about reducing the vulnerability of women and children, but in an environment where climate change is posing such a growing threat. This is a typical slide that we associate with thinking about the impacts of climate change. And we tend to think about climate change, oh, there's more extreme events, you know, these stories of flooding, whether it's in Houston or whether it's in Peru, or as in this picture, it's in Pakistan. Pakistan suffered absolutely devastating floods in 2008 and 2010. An area the size of Italy was underwater at one point, and that's about 1/5 of Pakistan's land area. Floods don't kill people or don't kill large numbers of people. This flood actually killed 2,000 people, but it affected about 20 million people. And when we talk about being affected by events like this, we're not just talking about loss of life and injury, we're talking about loss of livelihoods, loss of agricultural land, loss of people's homes, for children, loss of school days that affects their future. And of those 20 million people affected, approximately 85%, were women and children. And around 500,000 of those were pregnant women. And floods also destroyed more than 200 hospitals and clinics. So as you can see, it's layer upon layer of vulnerability. If I go to a sort of slightly more granular level, I'm trying to get to change. You know, this picture was taken in Peru. We're doing a lot of work in Peru at the moment on the reconstruction, which I'll come on to later. But this just gives you a real insight into what the impacts of climate change look like at a household level. And, you know, we did some work with the government in Peru looking very specifically at the impacts on women and children in order to inform the recovery. And about 1/3 of those affected in northern Peru were children, and 200,000 of those were younger than 5 years old. And so just imagine, you know, the role of mothers dealing with children in these kinds of circumstances. And these are the pictures of climate change that we too often don't see. And the important thing that, you know, really came across very strongly in Peru was the way in which climate change and the impacts of climate events like this compound the challenges that women and children already face. 80% of rural Peruvian children experience poverty, and over 56,000 Peruvian girls are forced into marriage, and about a third of the women have no independent income of their own. And the reality is that, women are an incredibly vulnerable group, and therefore they're very, very badly affected when it comes to these extreme events. But it's not just the extreme events. It's actually what is increasingly becoming day-to-day events. And the next few slides that I'm going to show you were taken in Dhaka, in Bangladesh, in a community called the Matchstick Colony, which is in southern Dhaka, which is suffering very badly from flooding, as you can see in this picture. And what these pictures illustrate is really the impact on sort of day-to-day life, and particularly the impact on women and on children. So I'm trouble showing the size. And so just, women have to bear the brunt of the impacts, because they somehow have to carry on with their household duties, even when their homes are underwater. The other very big challenge that we encountered in this community was actually just simply the challenge of getting around. So much of our day-to-day lives relies on children going to school, people going to work, even being able to just get around to hang up the washing. And what was very apparent working with this community was their resilience comes from their willingness to help each other, to recognize the needs of those that are mobility impaired or elderly. And the second thing that we really learned in this community was how small interventions can make a very big difference. I normally show this lady on the right, and alongside it people in Venice walking through the flooded streets, in St. Mark's Square. It's the same intervention. We don't have to make life complicated. And in fact, we made the mistake going into this community of thinking we could be very clever and come up with some really clever, sophisticated physical intervention. And actually that wasn't what they needed. And we just learned so much about adaptive capacity and resilience, because it's the women and it's the children, it's the elderly, all helping each other and pulling together that makes the biggest difference. I think this lady on the right's demeanor says it all. Life is hard and climate change is making it worse. We had a really interesting conversation before I took this picture, and I said, how do you manage with all this flood water? And she said, I've always managed, it's always flooded here. It's just that it's getting worse. And she said, we can manage if the flood water comes and stays around for 3 or 4 days and then goes. But she said, the problem now is it's coming and it's staying around for 20 days and sometimes 30 days. And so the really very sophisticated coping mechanisms that they've created to manage to live in these environments are beginning to fail, because the challenges they're facing are just getting so much worse. Of course, it isn't always too much water. In some places, the issue is too little water, water scarcity. This is an image of the reservoirs outside Cape Town during the sort of countdown to day zero. Day zero thankfully didn't arrive. If it had, it would have been the biggest crisis ever, with 5 million people in one city with no access to water. But the reservoirs outside Cape Town are their major water source. And it was climate stressors that were largely responsible for the depletion of the water in the reservoirs. They had, reduced rainfall year on year for several years. But water scarcity matters particularly for women, because wherever you go in the world, it's women and children also who are burdened with the responsibility of water collection, and particularly during water scarcities. In 80% of households with water shortages, it's the women and the girls who are expected to go and get the water. And UNICEF have calculated that 200 million hours are spent by girls and women collecting that water every day. And it's one of the primary reasons that girls don't go to school, because they don't have time to go to school, because their day is taken up walking to water sources. And obviously with climate change, quite often water sources are getting much more remote. And so those journeys to go and collect water every day are longer and longer. But there's also secondary implications of water scarcity. Transporting and storing water increases the risk of contamination, and that creates, disease, and that has a big impact, diarrheal disease, particularly on children, as a result of poor sanitation, poor hygiene, and unsafe drinking water. But perhaps the sort of biggest secondary effect on women who are fetching and carrying water is their exposure to violence. They're on their own, often walking very big distances, and it's a very, very frightening job, a very unsafe job to have to do each day. The other side of climate change is increasing temperatures. And there's research that we've been carrying out onto the impacts of heat stress on communities, and lots of evidence about the negative impacts on health, and also the much higher risk of aggression and violence. It reduces the ability of children to learn, and children are much more vulnerable to heat-related morbidity and mortality. I mean, just simply because they've got smaller bodies, a smaller body mass to surface area, and so their ability to shed heat is much less than us as adults. The year before last now was the joint hottest year on record, and we know that's going to continue. And the effects of heat and the effects of heat on women and families is not a well-researched area to date, but yet an important one. And whether it's too little water, too much water, or increased temperatures or extreme events, they all have one thing in common. One of their main impacts is displacement. Climate events converge with other threats to cause this displacement, and those that are on the move are hugely vulnerable. In 2020, weather-related events caused nearly 10 million new internal displacements, so that's within a country, of children. And 80% of people displaced by climate change are women. That's research that's being published by UNDP. And then again, the research just keeps coming up with it exacerbates the challenges that women face in terms of domestic violence, in terms of harassment, in terms of trafficking, and in terms of forced marriage. And this is work that we're very interested in at the moment. There's a lot of interest from academics and policymakers on the relationship between climate events and conflict between communities or violence within communities. Simply because climate events aggravate, expose, or interact with other risk factors that cause violence, whether that's alcohol consumption or bad governance or resource scarcities. And in every case, there's just growing amount of literature which is talking about the disproportionate impacts on women. There's research in America that says for every 5-degree increase in daily mean temperature, there's a 4.5% increase in cases of sexual violence. In Somalia, there is many more displaced women as a result of the drier and much more erratic weather. And so women are on the move, they don't have the protection of their families, and are in fear of rape and sexual violence. So these are really, very big challenges, for women in the areas of the world that are currently very affected by climate change. And increasingly, I think these trends will, affect more and more communities, including in places like the UK, as we begin to see the impacts here. So what to do about it on a sort of more cheerful, on a more cheerful note? There is progress, and there is considerably more thinking about women and what to do to help women and children than there was a few years ago. I think the first thing is just simply really recognizing women and children as a very vulnerable group, and putting them at the center of whatever is happening to either recover from disaster or prevent disaster, or to build resilience. These pictures are from a program, Reconstrucción con Cambios, which means sort of reconstruction with changes. It's the Peruvian version of sort of Build Back Better. I was working in Sri Lanka and Indonesia after the tsunami, when the sort of Build Back Better term got coined by President Clinton. And at the time, it was, originally very much focused. People were talking about it in terms of, building back better. Could we make tsunami-resistant houses? Which is, of course, fairly ridiculous given the force of the tsunami. But quickly people realized that actually Build Back Better is about building back so that communities are stronger and therefore better able to cope and withstand future events. So it's not about stronger construction, it's about strengthening communities. And that means really putting children and women at the heart of recovery, which is what they've done in Peru. A very significant analysis was carried out to really understand their challenges and needs, where GESI principles, gender, equity and social inclusion, were embedded in the approach from the outside. And what that resulted in is actually that the program has prioritized the reconstruction of schools, of healthcare facilities, as well as flood defense improvements and early warning systems. And as you can see from this picture that left, it's been done in a very inclusive and participatory way. The second thing is really the growing recognition that sort of shelter houses, housing homes, and that's a continuum, is really the starting point for strengthening communities. This is a particular area of my interest and expertise. And, I've watched families affected by climate events, out there in the open, exposed to the elements, without blankets if it's a cold climate, without shade if it's a warm climate. And, they lose their sense of identity. Women lose their sense of identity when they can't fulfill their roles as mothers, as carers, as wives. And, women living in tents or for protracted periods of time actually means you're losing that human resource of the community itself. And when you give a family like this family on the left the keys to a really fairly basic shelter, it's like unlocking the key to who they are. And the smile says it all. And this lady had been living in a tent for nearly 6 months. And then you go back, a couple of months later, and, that very basic structure that you've designed and constructed has become a home. It's painted, there's ownership. In other pictures I've got, there's, plants, outside washing on the line. And it really makes you realize that this sort of continuum of shelter to houses, to housing, to homes is something that is so important and yet so overlooked. And too often when the sort of architectural community and the engineering community get involved in this discussion, they focus on some very clever form of structure without actually really a shelter, without really thinking what's the difference between a shelter and a home. And that's a sort of very interesting, there's a lot of very interesting literature out there. We need to make sure that our homes are habitable in a changing climate. And that's about the comfort conditions in homes. And it's also about being able to get to and from our homes. And these are just a couple of pictures of projects that we're doing. The one on the left is a Cool Roofs project in Mexico, which I'm very excited about because we initially worked in India in 2008, which was when I was first beginning to get involved in climate adaptation, painting roofs white in India. And now this is quite a significant project, painting roofs white in Mexico. And it really does make a massive difference to the internal temperatures and the habitability of those buildings. And then on the right, this is from the community I was showing you earlier, really a very simple intervention. The stepping stones didn't work because the water level had got too high. And so we came up with this as an alternative. And you can see the happiness on this lady's face. But it isn't just habitability, it's also safety. And these are pictures from Pakistan, from that big flood event following that big flood event that I showed you earlier. And what happened is that most of the housing in the area affected is built out of different forms of adobe and soil and brick construction. And homes were completely destroyed, but people couldn't move. You know, this is where their livelihoods are. They don't have the choice to go and move to areas that are less exposed. And so this was a very, very big research project that went on for 3 years research and then 3 years implementation, looking at the vernacular building technologies. And we partnered with the University of Peshawar, and we designed what we thought were improvements to make these buildings more flood resistant. So they didn't fall down. And the picture on the top left is the sort of massive swimming pool that we built. And I'm not going to run the video because it generally doesn't work. But those are examples of sections of walls where we were trying out the new technology, and we flooded, you know, the water went in and the water level rose, and we left the water standing around, mimicking a flood event, to really try out new forms of building technology so that people could stay in their homes. And as I said, you know, homes is just such an important part of the resilience of communities. You mentioned in your opening remarks, you know, the importance of involving women. In my time working, so the last 20 years working in these kinds of environments, you know, I'm very happy to say that the conversation sort of, or the way of engaging has moved from consultation to participation, and they are so different. You know, consulting is asking people what they need, what do they want, and then going to do it for them. Whereas participation is engagement. Your role is as an enabler. And, you know, there are different games. There are well-established participatory techniques for engaging people and helping them, bringing people together and helping them identify their needs collectively and prioritize their needs collectively. And as you can see for here, there's a lot of fun and a lot of laughter involved. One of the things that I've learned is that you really have to understand the communities in which you work. You know, I've made mistakes because I've thought I've engaged the women, and then it's months later that I've realized that actually the women have been in mourning for 3 months, and therefore they've been hidden away, because in some communities, when they lose loved ones, the women go into mourning and they're not there, so they're actually not part of that early decision making. And that's, you know, that's all learning, and, you know, just really being aware that, you know, in many ways we women are the same all around the world, but our cultural norms are so very different in the different places that we work. I've just got a couple more slides. You can't talk about women without addressing the needs of children. You know, women and children need to be considered together and separately. A child born today, compared to when I was born, is likely to experience twice as many wildfires in their lifetime, 3 times the exposure to crop failure, 3 times the exposure to droughts or flooding, and 6 or 7 times more exposure to heat waves in their lifetime. You know, our children are growing up in a very different and a very difficult world. And reducing the vulnerability of their carers, which might be their mothers, it might be their grandmothers, it might be relatives or family, particularly through interventions that relate to livelihoods and empowering women, which is what you can see in the bottom right, you know, may be a much better intervention than actually improving the quality of their shelter. And, you know, really thinking hard about the specific needs of children. You know, children need environments in which they don't just survive, they need to thrive. And this slide sort of got, it relates to work that we've done with the Bernard Van Leeuwen Foundation and Urban 95 to develop a sort of design guide which is specifically focused about thinking about the needs of children in refugee or IDP camps. And that was something that when we started this was a need that was completely overlooked. And I've worked in a lot of refugee camps and IDP camps, and apart from the occasional playground or football pitch, you know, the needs of children are generally not looked at. And if we don't invest in our children, we're losing an incredibly important future resource. And that brings me on to the sort of session I chaired at COP, which very much relates to your Diverse City project, which I'm very excited to learn about and look forward to learning more about. We've been working with various organizations, Lego, Real Play, IKEA, etc., looking at the role of children, the role of cities in helping children develop, particularly looking at play. And where that's led us is actually research which shows and demonstrates that the importance of nature-based play for children. Nature-based play, as opposed to sort of playground play, actually wires children's brains differently. And the qualities that it creates in terms of curiosity, in terms of exploration, in terms of sort of dealing with things going wrong, are actually qualities that are necessary for children to grow up and to be resilient to whatever happens in their lives. But also, of course, that if children develop that early relationship with nature and their carers develop that early relationship with nature, they fall in love with nature, as I did as a child, and they want to look after and safeguard nature in the future. And then, of course, if we've got green spaces in cities that are good for our children, they're also contributing to biodiversity, and they're also helping provide ecosystem services to combat climate change, such as attenuating water, providing shade, as well as absorbing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. So, we've come to the conclusion that actually, one of the best interventions for climate change is to invest in green spaces in cities where our children can play. And, it's a reinforcing cycle of win-win. But I wanted to end with this final slide that really brings me back to resilience. We can't predict the future, but we can be pretty confident that the future is going to be increasingly challenging. Whether that's due to floods or heat waves or water scarcity, displacement, violence, all of these things are real, and they are happening, and they're happening more frequently. We need to do what we can to reduce poverty and vulnerability. We need to maximize the ability of women and children and the communities they care for and contribute to be able to adapt and recover quickly. And that's what resilience is all about. It's that ability to deal with whatever happens. And a key part of this, as well as early childhood development, is taking the time to reflect, to learn, to share, so that we can make better decisions and different choices. And it's events like these that really matter. And thank you very much for the opportunity here today to share my experience, and very much look forward to hearing from the other speakers. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much, Jo. That's exceeded my expectations in terms of excitement. And move on to introducing our first panellist. We've given them hardly any time to introduce themselves, but just to give you a flavour of what they are involved with and what's exciting them, we start with Dawn Bonfield, who is a materials engineer by background. Dawn is past president and former CEO of the Women's Engineering Society. She runs a social enterprise called Magnificent Women, looking at the history of women in engineering, and has her own consultancy company, Towards Vision. She works at 2 UK universities and has roles with a number of international organisations, which is what she's going to talk to you about today.
Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me, and what an absolute pleasure to follow on from listening to Jo Da Silva, who's one of my absolute inspirations, and someone that I actually saw at COP from a distance and didn't say hello to, and regret not having said hello to you, Jo, at COP. So hopefully we can meet at some point and carry on this conversation. But I just wanted to talk about 3 different roles that I currently have. One of them is through an organisation called the World Federation of Engineering Organisations, WFEO. And I represent the women, I represent the UK actually on a couple of committees there. I'm deputy chair of the Women in Engineering Committee. And amongst the kind of themes and priorities and strategies and themes that committee has, they're obviously looking at diversity in engineering in terms of capacity building, women's retention, women's leadership and progression. But the thing that is more relevant to this conversation is that they are looking at how we use engineering and technology solutions to help women all around the world. So following on from what Jo was saying, you know, we see very clearly that women are disproportionately disadvantaged by all sorts of things in their lives. And when it comes to climate change, you know, Jo's given really concrete examples of how that manifests itself. And what we're interested in doing is looking at how we use technology to address some of those inequalities. So, for example, what we're talking about are not things that particularly are aimed at women, but technologies that can understand the difficulties that women have, or the lack of access or the lack of information that women have, and build that into their solutions. So it's looking at things like how women access finance and the use of microfinance, which is a really good example of how women use funding to develop their small holdings on an incremental scale. Just going back to my other examples, really. So access to water, obviously we can see that water plays a big influence on their lives. So making technology that isn't aimed at women, but will help women disproportionately, if you like. So our role at WFEO is to try to understand things like the work that Jo is doing in how women and children are impacted, and then be able to pass that on to engineers around the world, because WFEO represents about 30 million engineers from the different professional institutions that are members. So it's representing that perspective, really, and trying to get them to build these into their solutions. The second thing I was going to just mention is the work I do at Aston University, where I'm Royal Academy of Engineering Visiting Professor of Inclusive Engineering. And similarly, that's about making sure that engineering, not necessarily for developing countries, but engineering in general, is free of bias and accessible to all. So it's making sure that engineers understand how they can be inadvertently, in most cases, embedding biases into their solutions, into maybe the algorithms that are part of the technology that they're producing, and making sure that they have, obviously, having a diverse team of engineers will be one step on the journey to creating those inclusive and those diverse solutions, if you like, but it's all about raising awareness of how this is something else that they need to be thinking about. And obviously the gender perspective is one perspective, but there are many other perspectives as well, to ensure that we have technology and engineering that isn't disadvantaging certain communities or certain groups of people, and knowing what that looks like in terms of decision making for engineers. So, you know, when they're making a decision that might look like a choice of two materials, for example, for ducting in a building, one material might have a negative impact on a certain community of people because they live next to the pollution of that, whereas another material that has the same properties may not have that same impact. So it's making those impacts visible to people who are making those decisions. And then the third thing that I do is I work here where I am today at King's College London, where I'm a Royal Society Entrepreneur in Residence. And this particular role is about helping students to become more empowered and more confident to use their engineering and technology skills to address the Sustainable Development Goals. And obviously, women entrepreneurs are in the minority, as women are in engineering. So it's got a particular focus on supporting and encouraging women to become either entrepreneurs or intrapreneurs or social change makers, but to be empowered and to use those entrepreneurial skills and tools in their role as engineers. So that's what I wanted to tell you about. So I'll pass back to you, Pam.
I'm going to move swiftly on because I want to leave enough time for questions to Jeremy Millard, who is a researcher, activist and consultant working for many Danish, British and Irish universities and international organisations like the UN, the EU, the OECD. His interests span a broad range of areas, including sustainable development, city regional systems, good governance, technology and society, social innovation, poverty reduction and inclusion. And I know he's going to take us into some of the imbalances in impact in the developing world and consider improving diversity and interconnectivity as ways of achieving sustainability and resilience. Jeremy.
Yes, hello, and thank you for the invitation. I hope you can hear me. I'm actually semi-retired, but that doesn't mean, it means I'm working even harder. But I'm sitting at home relaxing. I hope that's okay, not in a fancy office somewhere. So I want to talk about gender and climate issues in northern rural Ghana. That's on the edge of the Sahel, of course, with increasing desertification. So some of the things Joe was mentioning about heat and drought are very relevant here. Now, my wife and her colleagues, I'm married to a wonderful woman, and she's working a lot in this area with her colleagues. I support her occasionally when I get the chance on these issues with local Ghanaian partners, including NGOs. So it's basically Danish money and a Danish NGO who they called Ghana Friends, and they work with local organizations, governments and trade unions, but also NGOs down there. The purpose is to directly support women and youth, actually, but let's focus on the women, to navigate their relative vulnerability made worse by climate change. So it's to direct support to provided to women through a lot of activities and programs. I guess the first place to start is thinking they need to have their awareness raised and to be self-advocates as well as to be part of an advocacy movement. So awareness and advocacy are really important here amongst the women themselves, but also in their villages. Because don't forget, these villages are remote. The women involved rarely have any education, if at all. They're almost always men in hierarchical positions in society, whether they're Christian or Muslim patriarchal societies. So the first step has always been to actually work with these women and with these communities and the village elders and everybody else in the village to get it accepted that the prime role of women in improving conditions and addressing climate change will dramatically benefit everybody. Now that sometimes takes a long time to do, but it's an essential first step. So what happens as part of this and in conjunction with that is setting up and supporting women's groups by strengthening their organizational managerial capabilities, providing them access to resources, including finance, but also networking, skills development, for example, setting up entrepreneurial business activities, finding their position in the value chain, identifying what sort of things they can do in that context, providing advice and relative support. And the examples include microfinance, which Dawn has mentioned. In this particular context in North Ghana, soya and rice cultivation, processing, marketing and selling. And one great surprise, or I say not surprise, delight, was that how easy it was, even in a rural village where education levels are low, by just providing incentives and opportunities and knowing that the women are supported by the village as a whole, these women are really entrepreneurial. They just need the help and the push and the knowledge that the support around them, their families and the rest of the village are with them on this. And so the help that was being provided through these programs is essential, of course, but it's really an amazing awareness that my wife anyway has come across in these villages. Looking at climate change and biodiversity loss, this is of course hugely added to the problems which they see, and so the need for this diversity in getting women involved and the sorts of activities they are involved in has been strengthened than when the program started many years ago. So this involves cultivating new crops and new crop varieties which can withstand the changing climate, and even more scientific activities regarding animal husbandry, using the local university and other agencies, focusing much more on agroforestry, looking for synergies between all these elements, together with the food processing and marketing activities which they're also getting involved with. So the key here, I think, is synergies in diversity in all the aspects which we're looking at. And the aim, in the same way that Joe was talking about, is to improve resilience. The resilience of these women and their communities in all aspects. And this moves on to finally a particular aspect I'm interested in, which is looking at a another way of looking at sustainability and resilience. I mean, this is not replacing existing ways, and this is just one aspect of it, of course. But this dovetails nicely into the work I'm doing with the UN and the EC on rethinking sustainability in the context of COVID-19 and all the other threats and challenges which we're seeing, which we will continue to see in the future, and new pandemics, climate change, of course, and we're seeing today, political and other pressures taking place in Europe, and these things will continue probably as well. Insecurity, mass misinformation, etc. So I think we're in for a time of greater insecurity and uncertainty in Africa, but also in Europe and many other places. In this context, one of the things I'm looking at is to see sustainability much more in terms of adjusting the balance between efficiency and resilience. Now, of course, over the last 40 years, we've seen it's all about efficiency, squeezing assets and making things as efficient as possible by saving money. We still need a lot of efficiency, of course. We don't want to waste money on other resources, but we do need to move much more towards resilience to get a new sweet spot between resilience and efficiency. Now, what do I mean by resilience in this context? Okay, it's the ability to withstand and survive shocks. But what does it really mean in this context? How does resilience, how should it work? And I think this is in some ways reflecting what Joe was saying and what Dawn was saying. I think there are two main elements that I want to focus on. There are, of course, other ones as well. But the first one, of course, is diversity. We probably need diversity in most things: people, talent, skills, capacities, resources, voices, supply chains, you name it. The ability to be able to switch to new sources of knowledge and input, new types of support, drawing upon beneficial insights when these shocks occur. For example, in an economic context, not just in time, which is really screwing efficiency to its maximum, but also just in case, because we don't know what shocks and emergencies are going to come along down the road. So the second is interconnectivity. We need to connect all this diversity together, both virtually, but also critically directly between human beings as human beings. And Joe visiting all these places and my wife working in Northern Ghana, the human element is critical in this interconnectivity. But for interconnectivity to work well, we need transparency, of course, openness, high ethical standards, non-exploitative processes, inclusive, participative, fair and just processes, all those things which we normally think about. But if you don't have these things, diversity is wasted. And this has been the theme of a lot of the discussion today. Exclusion increases. Everybody, including the people who are already included, the rich, they suffer, of course. So there's huge evidence for all this as well. So what I'm saying basically is we need diversity, but we also need interconnectivity, which is open and transparent. And I think that's one of the keys to tackling, this new era of shocks and emergencies which we're now confronting. That's all I want to say for the moment. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Jeremy. Magali is our final speaker today. Magali Thompson is an architect and a public practice associate placed at Great Ormond Street Hospital in London, where she is project lead for placemaking. So we're coming really a lot closer to home now. Magali has recently completed an MSc in Cities at the London School of Economics, complementing her work at GOSH, as we call Great Ormond Street, building on her passion for equitable cities, especially in relation to children and older people. Magali is a founder member of the steering group for Equilibrium, like me. She's active in our Diverse City project, and she's a design council expert and on several design review panels. Over to you, Magali.
Thank you, Pam, and thanks everyone else and Joe for a really inspiring keynote. It's really great to be part of the panel. I'll spend a couple of minutes telling you about my role at Great Ormond Street Hospital and then give you a brief introduction to the Diversity Project, which is this European project which we at Equilibrium are supporting. So in terms of my work at GOSH, I'm involved in creating a brief and vision for a child-friendly and greener streets around the hospital. Like many London hospitals, we are surrounded by streets which go over World Health air quality limits daily, as well as that the street is congested, unsafe, noisy and angry as a result. Those that are most vulnerable are the most affected, and particularly relevant in this case are children who are unwell and even more susceptible to pollutants. So I guess I'm always trying to explain that there's no point, I don't think, in treating children with respiratory illnesses in hospitals if they go straight onto streets like ours afterwards. We know that 80% of our health is shaped by non-clinical factors, such as our individual behaviours and where we live, what we eat, our neighbourhoods. So it's impossible, I don't think, to talk about place without linking it to health. Data issued by the Office for National Statistics shows that prior to the pandemic, there was a gap sometimes of almost 20 years in that women can expect to live in good health between the richest and poorest areas of London. And that's in England, but even in London, there are huge gaps like that. And this doesn't take into account the pandemic where rates of infection and death have been higher in poorer areas. Many of these themes feed into the diversity project, which we in Equilibrium are involved in, how important it is to ensure processes involve everyone, to ensure that our solutions are balanced. So diversity is a 4-year project funded by the European Commission, which will focus on creating living labs in 5 European cities: Aarhus, Bucharest, Castellón, Orvieto and Potsdam. The project will address the interface of social inequality, health conditions and air pollution in these cities and provide a living lab in each city which will seek to improve local outcomes. Our purpose at Equilibrium is to enable women to have equal influence in the design and delivery of the built environment. The more participatory the process, the more participatory the outcomes. In terms of our input into the diversity project, we are there to ensure that all protected groups, which include women and children, are fully involved and empowered throughout the project. Examples will include developing frameworks for participatory activities, identifying data gaps in cities, and working with the cities to create a network of wider participants in each of the cities. We will look to provide an inclusive narrative and also emphasise the requirement for qualitative data which reflects people's lived experience. You can find out more about the project at the website diversity.eu, which we can put into the chat, and we'll be holding an event dedicated to the project in a couple of months' time. That's all from me now. Hand back to you. Thank you, Pam.
Thank you so much for your time today. I'd love to have had longer, but it's been absolutely great to have you all. It's been a very inspiring session and bringing a particularly new dimension, I think, for many of us to the issues that we're all addressing in terms of climate change and the role of women and children in creating that future. Thank you all very much indeed for joining us, and particular thanks to our panelists.